All right, we are in 2 Samuel chapter 2 tonight. And if I could get a show of hands as to who does not presently have a workbook for the 2 Samuel class. Get one to you. All right. Go. 2 Samuel chapter 2. And last time we looked at the first 11 verses and how David was made king over the southern area of Judah, while Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, was made king over the rest of Israel. And Ishbosheth had his main base of power actually not in the tribal territory of Benjamin, where you would expect him to have it, but rather across the Jordan River in the place called Mahanaim, which is a Gileadite area. I don't know exactly why that was particularly the place where he goes, but that seems to be what's taken place here. And I know that we read this last time, but I want to reread verses 12 through 17. Can I get a volunteer to read chapter 2, verses 12 through 17?
Go ahead.
Okay. I'll draw kind of a crude map up here on the board. All right, Hebron is located right here. I'll put an H for Hebron. Mahanaim would be located over here on this side of the Jordan. And then Gibeon, it'll indicate with a G there, would kind of have been a little northward in the area of Bethlehem. Now, who is the aggressor in this conflict that we just read about? Abner is the aggressor. That's right. Abner is the one who brings his forces to Gibeon from Mahanaim. And in response, David, of course, Joab, the commander of David's army, goes and he meets and they confront each other at the pool of Gibeon. But Abner is definitely the aggressor in this conflict. And how do they conduct this particular battle? Okay, there's a pool in the middle. They all play chicken in the pool or something. I don't know. What is it that they do? I'm sorry? They wrestled. You get the impression more like they say that they hold a contest. They're definitely fighting with swords because they named the place Helkath Hatzarim, and because they are using swords in verse 16. Helkath Hatzarim means field of the sword edges. So they are killing each other in this instance. Yes, Jen. It gets a little more. What is going on here is that Abner and Joab have this agreement. It's Abner's proposal. Really, let the young men arise and hold a contest before us. So what they do is they pick 12 men for one side, and 12 men for the other side, and then they fight. Now, what does this sound like? Have we seen anybody try to settle a conflict this way before in the Bible? This is the question I asked at the end of class last time. Is there another Bible story that this reminds us of, this particular military strategy? I'm sorry? Is it David and Goliath? Yeah, it is. In David and Goliath, Goliath's proposal was that we don't need to have a big, drawn-out battle. We'll just pick our champions and have them fight it out. And whichever champion wins, that side is automatically the winner of the battle. Well, did that work? No, it didn't work. Well, what happened after the Philistine champion was dead? The Philistines just roll over and surrender? They ran away. They refused to submit. So they didn't do what Goliath said they would do and say, oh, you beat me, we'll become your servants. That's not what happened. What happened is they still had a battle and they still ran away from the battle and it didn't settle anything. Well, here, they're having a contest of 12 champions on each side. Does that work? Now, what are we supposed to see when we see that how similar this is to the battle between David and Goliath? What does that suggest is going on here? What applications can we make from that? I'm not understanding. Well, yeah, this is definitely for control of Israel. David has this region of the southern region of Judah. Ishbosheth has the rest of Israel under his control. And Ishbosheth launches this offensive against David's smaller kingdom. Even though David is the Lord's anointed, even though he is the one that God has chosen to lead the people, Ishbosheth still resists his rule. So there is a kind of a rebellion against the Lord's plan going on here. Jen? That is an interesting point. Neither of the kings is at this battle. David is not here, and Ishbosheth is not here. Instead, this is a contest between the two commanders of the army. At the first part of chapter 2, we had two rival kings anointed. Now we have two rival commanders, and they're going to struggle for power here. We noted last time that Abner was the cousin of Saul. We'll get into who Joab was in a little bit if we have time. But they exchange swordmen, and they have combat. And the fact that it's interesting that the men of Israel are adopting a Philistine battle strategy. The folks of northern Israel have kind of become like, the Philistines. They've imitated the practices of the nations. They are no different than those nations in Psalm 2 who conspire against the Lord and against His anointed, saying, let us cast their fetters from us. Jen? Gladiator combat. Well, yeah, that's the idea. And that's what's going on. Similar to what's going on with David and Goliath, too. It was a similar premise. And of course, this military strategy was Abner's idea. And it doesn't work. In fact, everything we see in chapters 2 and 3 is dominated by Abner's failures at everything he attempts to do. Abner has a military strategy that results in the defeat of his own army. Abner has a power play that results in his falling out with Ishbosheth the king. Abner later has a negotiation that winds up resulting in his getting stabbed to death in the gate of Hebron. Abner is not a very lucky man. And the truth is that there's all sorts of problems with the way he's behaving and his conduct. And so there's the problem. Verse 16 is ambiguous about who kills who, but the text is not ambiguous about who wins the battle. Who wins the battle? Right, Joab's men win the battle. They have this contest of champions. The place where the fight takes place is Hatzarim, which is the field of the sword edges. And in verse 17 it says, that day the battle was very severe, and Abner and the men of Israel were beaten before the servants of David. Now, the truth is that if we just had verse 17, they were beaten before the servants of David, and then verses 30 and 31, Joab returned from following Abner, where he had gathered all the people together. 19 of David's servants besides Asahel were missing, but the servants of David had struck down many of the Philistines and Abner's men, so that 360 men died. That's just a summary of the battle and, the various casualties that took place. And we learned that, 19 of David's people plus a guy named Asahel died in verse 30. But on the Israel side, 360 men died. So who won this battle that day? Judah did. But the thing is that in between that, there's a rather lengthy description of how Asahel in particular died. And let's read that in verses 18 through 29. Any volunteers? Read. Yes. All the way down to verse 29. All right. Why does Abner kill Asahel here? Because he was chasing him. It's kind of interesting how this whole thing plays out, of course. Asahel pursues Abner, and Abner doesn't kill him right away. He kind of tries to persuade him to stop. Oh, go bother one of my other men, try to sacrifice one of your other soldiers. Why should I strike you down? He doesn't want to kill Joab's brother because, then Joab's going to be mad at him. Of course, Joab is mad at him, and Joab later kills him over this issue in chapter 3. Abner is afraid of the repercussions, and rightly so. And then we have kind of a gruesome sounding death. Asahel impaled, and this kind of depends on translation. Mine says that he was impaled on the butt end of the spear. That's pretty hard to do. There's another way, a simpler way to read it is just a back thrust of the spear, in which he just reverses the spear and throws it into him while he's pursuing him, which seems to be a little more sensical. Well, at the end of this, Abner and Joab exchange some words. And what would you say is the point of this exchange in verses 24 through 29? What's going on here? Why are we still fighting? Okay. Abner's the one that says this. What's wrong with that idea? I guess what's weird about the fact that Abner says, why are you still chasing us? What was his idea? It was his idea to have the fight in the first place. They're the ones that moved from Mahanaim to Gibeon and started this aggression in the first place. They're the ones that proposed, hey, let's have a single combat to settle the crisis and the conflict. And now, stop chasing us, stop chasing us. We've changed our minds. We don't want to do this anymore. After we twice aggressed and instigated this conflict, all of a sudden we want to get away. So Abner tells Joab, call off the pursuit. Will the sword devour forever? Let's prevent some more senseless bloodshed. Well, the truth is that if Abner had not suggested combat, if he had not gone to fight out at Gibeon, if, for that matter, he had not installed Ishbosheth as a rival to David, then none of this mess would have happened. And Asahel would not be dead. Abner would not have been placed in the situation where he had to kill him. And Israel would not have had to suffer. You see, all of these repercussions happen for one very basic, simple reason. Someone didn't like who the Lord put in charge. That's what the real issue is here. Someone did not like the fact that God had installed His anointed king and said, no, I want someone else to be king. I want someone else to be in charge. And once you start down that path, well, that's the path of death, destruction. People are going to get hurt. Whenever somebody rebels against the authority of the Lord's anointed, people get hurt. That's what's taking place here. So does Abner really have room to complain for the mess he's gotten himself into? Does not appear so. Verses 30 through 32, Joab returned from following Abner. When he had gathered all the people together, 19 of David's servants, besides Asahel, were missing. But the servants of David had struck down many of Benjamin and Abner's men, so that 360 men died. They took up Asahel and buried him in his father's tomb, which was in Bethlehem. And Joab and his men went all night until the day dawned at Hebron. As you see the death tolls, whose side was God on in this battle? Now, the text does not say whose side God was on. But whose side was He on? And how do we know that? Because of the casualties. Look at the numbers. Look who won. Look who lost. It becomes pretty evident that the Lord was not with Israel. Ishbosheth does not have his blessing. I want to make a note in passing about who these guys are that the text mentions. There's Abishai, and there's Joab, and there's Asahel. And they're all three brothers, and they are all sons of Zeruiah. Now you're going to see this constant reference throughout the text. The sons of Zeruiah. David complains about the sons of Zeruiah in chapter 3 and how they are too difficult for them. Who is this person? Anybody know? Who is Zeruiah? Huh? David's half-sister. Interesting. Yeah. Well, yeah, Zeruiah was David's sister, according to 1 Chronicles. Where did I wrote this down somewhere in my. Half-sister. There's actually a debate about whether she's his half-sister or his full sister. And it just, I guess, depends on how you understand the reference. In 1 Chronicles, I believe it's chapter 3. 1 Chronicles chapter 2. Yeah, first of all, Zeruiah was a woman, not a man. And 1 Chronicles chapter 2 and verse 16 indicates that she was David's sister. It said, 1 Chronicles 2 lists a bunch of Jesse's sons, Eliab, Abinadab, Shimeah, Nethanel, Radai, Ozem, and David. And their sisters were Zeruiah and Abigail. And the three sons of Zeruiah were Abishai, Joab, and Asahel. That's in 1 Chronicles chapter 2. Now this is kind of interesting because that would make all of these guys David's nephews. Now, Joab is a pretty significant character throughout the book of 2 Samuel, excuse me. And he causes a lot of problems for David, but he stays the commander of his army for quite a while. And it seems like every time he gets thrown out, well, it's just another couple of pages and he's back in the position again. Now, how is it that Joab is able to hold on to power and get away with so much while David is king? Well, a good deal of it might have to do with this. David has a weakness for his family members. We're going to see that as we get into the rest of 2 Samuel, especially for his children. But it appears also for his nephews. He engages in quite a bit of, we should say, nepotism. That he shows preference and favoritism towards his family members. It's why Joab does stuff that's just as bad as some of the other people that David has killed immediately. And yet Joab is allowed to remain in position of authority for much longer than he should be. So that's just kind of a thing we note in passing. Chapter 3. In chapter 3, and I guess we'll begin reading in verse 1. And I'll read this and spare everybody reading all these names. There was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, and David grew steadily stronger, but the house of Saul grew weaker continually. Sons were born to David at Hebron. His firstborn was Amnon by Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and his second Chileab by Abigail, the widow of Nabal the Carmelite, and the third Absalom, the son of Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur, and the fourth Adonijah, the son of Haggith, and the fifth Shephatiah, the son of Abital, and the sixth Itraim by David's wife Eglah. These were born to David at Hebron. Right. So the text is right in the middle of telling us a story about a conflict between the house of David and the house of Saul, and then just out of the blue, the narrator decides, let me tell you who David's children were. It's probably not likely that all of these children were born in a short 2-year time period. So why in the world does he bring up all these children right here? Why list them here? Any ideas? I'm sorry? His house is strong? Does that contrast with anything? Yeah. It's really, the fact that so many sons are born to him is a direct elaboration on what it says in verse 1. That the house of David grew continually stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul grew weaker. Now, how did the house of David grow stronger? Well, one way is he had all these children. Of course, you get to verse 6, and it's the opposite of that. Instead of Saul's house growing stronger, what we see is Abner is making himself strong in the house of Saul. So, while David's house grows stronger, Saul's house grows weaker, while Abner makes himself strong in that house. And we'll talk about what that means in a minute. We have this list of David's children. The main point, of course, is to list the children that were born during his reign in Hebron. There's a later list in chapter 8 of the children that were born in Jerusalem. The full list of David's sons in 1 Chronicles chapter 3, there's about 20 of them actually. David had a lot of kids. He had about 20 sons, not counting any sons he may have had from concubines. But we don't even know the full extent of the list. It's really a large legacy. No patriarch had as many children as David did. And each son, though, what's most interesting about this is each son comes from a different wife. You've got Amnon, the son of Ahinoam, the Jezreelitess. Amnon is going to become famous later in chapter 13 as the wicked firstborn son who rapes his sister Tamar. Chileab is the son of Abigail. We know about Abigail from 1 Samuel 25 and how David acquired her for a wife. But we don't know anything about Chileab. He's never mentioned outside of these lists. He has a completely different name in Chronicles. He's called Daniel there. And he's never mentioned as a contender for the throne. We have Absalom. Absalom is the son of Maacah, a Geshurite princess. Anybody know who the Geshurites were? Were they Israelites? Or were they something else? Geshurites. Throw that out there. The Geshurites were actually a Canaanite people. And actually, if we remember back in 1 Samuel chapter 27, they were one of the peoples that David was at war with. He was at war with the Amalekites and the Geshurites and a couple of other different groups. Which is interesting that he now marries a woman who is a Geshurite princess and has this son named Absalom. Now, Absalom, that makes Absalom half Canaanite, when you boil it down. And incidentally, Absalom spends about 3 years in Geshur before coming home and staging a coup against his father. Was there any Canaanite influence in that? Who knows? It's possible, likely. But Absalom, of course, is going to dominate the narrative much later in 2 Samuel. Then you also have Adonijah, the son of Haggith. He'll be important in 1 Kings, chapters 1 and 2. And then you have a couple of others who we know nothing about, Shephatiah and Ithraim. But here's the other interesting point here. Is David violating any laws in this passage? Kings were not supposed to multiply wives for themselves. Deuteronomy chapter 17. Deuteronomy chapter 17 says this in verses 14 through 20. When you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, and you possess it and live in it, you will say, I will set a king over me like all the nations who are around me. You shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses, one from among your countrymen. You shall set as king over yourselves. You may not put a foreigner over yourselves who is not your countryman. Moreover, he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. Since the Lord has said to you, you shall never again return that way. He shall not multiply wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away. Nor shall he greatly increase silver and gold for himself. The 3 things the king is not supposed to multiply. Horses, for the danger of trusting God rather than, or for the danger of failing to trust God and trusting in military might instead. Wives, because of the danger of apostasy. And gold, because of the danger of forgetting God in prosperity. Now, Solomon breaks all these rules even more than David does. But David multiplies wives for himself. Yes, Jen? Yeah, that's true. God did do those things, but we'll discuss this more when we get in 1 Kings. But there is a major issue there with Solomon multiplying gold, horses, and wives for himself. The vast number of allusions to Deuteronomy 17 in the Solomon narrative is pretty telling in and of itself. Now there's a complex discussion here, of course. Did God place a stumbling block before him by blessing him with all of that wealth? Well, I mean, it's complicated. God blesses people with wealth, but he also warns in the law, do not forget the Lord your God in prosperity. Deuteronomy chapter 8 talks about that. That's kind of a side issue, though. May have time to discuss that at a later point. David, of course, has 6 wives, just from reading 2 Samuel 3. He's going to get a lot more wives, and at least one of them he's going to obtain through pretty bad means. That's Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah. As far as which, David is kind of different from Saul here. As far as we know, Saul only had one wife and also a concubine named Rizpah. And David, on the other hand, begins this precedent that gets more problematic in Solomon's day and more problematic in Rehoboam and Abijah's day as well, of this rampant monarchical polygamy. It's kind of tricky. There's a lot of discussion that's been generated about the subject of multiple wives in the Bible, because there's no passage anywhere in the Old Testament that says, thou shalt not ever have a second wife. And yet, I do think we can extrapolate that there's a problem with it based on principle. But I'm going to save that for the Q&A session, because there was a question submitted regarding that subject. So we'll get to that eventually. The Bible, one of the things we will note in passing, though, is that David's many different children, many different wives, creates a lot of chaos. It seems that the half-brothers think little of killing each other off in the story to secure their position on the throne. They're so enamored with the throne of David and the power that they could wield over Israel that they're willing to sacrifice each other to get to it. Now, contrasted to David, who's acquiring all these wives for himself, we get Abner in verses 6 through 11. It came about while there was war between the house of Saul and the house of David, that Abner was making himself strong in the house of Saul. So Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, and Ishbosheth said to Abner, why have you gone into my father's concubine? Then Abner was very angry over the words of Ishbosheth and said, "Am I a dog's head that belongs to Judah? Today I show kindness to the house of Saul your father, to his brothers and to his friends, and have not delivered you into the hands of David. And yet today you charge me with guilt concerning the woman. May God do so to Abner, and more also, if as the Lord has sworn to David, I do not accomplish this for him, to transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul and to establish the throne of Judah over Israel and over the throne of David over Israel and over Judah, from Dan even to Beersheba." He could no longer answer Abner a word because he was afraid of him. What does that mean in verse 6 when it says that Abner is making himself strong in the house of Saul? How's he doing that? Is he lifting weights? What's he doing? He's preparing to take over. Oh, Abner would never try to take over, would he? Well, he seems to have a kind of ambition to be power behind the throne. But how is he doing that? Dennis, did you say something? Building his influence over people? Okay. All right. Yeah, there is also another element to this. Ishbosheth kind of levels this accusation against him. "Why have you gone into my father's concubine?" Now there's, of course, another heated debate about whether Abner really did that or not. It's probably, if he did do that, that's probably what the meaning of the expression is, making himself strong in the house of Saul. But even though Ishbosheth is king, Abner's the real power. What would have been the issue with stealing the king's concubine, by the way? It is disrespectful. There was another thing going on too, though. Here. Another thing going on too. If you want to be king in the... Yes, Jen? Well, no, Solomon killed Adonijah because he tried to take Haggith. Abishag. Haggith was Adonijah's mother. Solomon had Adonijah killed because Adonijah tried to take one of his father's concubines. All right. If you want to become king in the ancient world, how do you do it? In the Bible stories, there's several ways to be king. One is you could be son of a king. That's the most popular way and probably the easiest way. Just be a king's son. If you can't do that, then marry a king's daughter. And yet another option is if you can't do that, if the king won't give his daughter to you, you could, and the Bible, of course, kill the previous king. That happens quite a bit in the Bible too. You kill off the king, you take the throne for himself. But there was a fourth way that people would sometimes use as well. You know what it was? Taking the women. Yes, take a wife of a previous king. And there are several examples of this. It almost always boils down to concubines, actually. For instance, during Absalom's coup, Ahithophel in 2 Samuel 16 suggests that, doesn't suggest, he advises Absalom, take your father's concubines into your tent in the sight of all Israel, so that they'll know that you've made yourself odious in the sight of your father. And the whole point of that is it's a political move for Absalom to show that he is now the new king. David had a concubine named Abishag, who Adonijah tried to marry in 1 Kings chapter 2. And again, that's a power play. And Solomon sees it for what it is. He doesn't let him do it. Instead, he accuses Adonijah of treason and has him executed. And of course, that would have been the issue of Abner is stealing Saul's concubine as well. He's trying to be king himself. It is a political move if he's doing that, to make himself strong in the house of Saul. There is one other interesting element of this. In 2 Kings, I think it's 2 Kings chapter 9, whenever Jehu decides he's going to kill off the whole house of Ahab, one of Jezebel's last actions is to adorn her face with makeup. Why? That's always been one of those puzzling things. But one very likely possibility is that Jezebel is trying to ensure her survival by saying, she even calls him Zimri, your master's murderer, on that occasion. But it was her way of saying to Jehu that, you can't become the legitimate king without my help. Of course, Jehu doesn't take her seriously. He has her thrown out the window. But that's another story in 2 Kings chapter 9. And as it happens, Jehu has no problem securing the throne for himself anyway. So anyhow, that's just something to keep in mind and be aware of. Now, Abner's little power play, if he is in fact making a political power grab, does not work. Ishbosheth accuses him of this. Abner says, I do all this for you and you accuse me of this? And then what does Abner do? He swears an oath to do what? Verses 9 and 10. I'm sorry? To help David become king. Why would Abner help David become king? Yes, Jen. Yeah, basically. Why? No. How dare you try to harm my father's house? Well, my response, well, you're trying to take the kingship away from me. Okay, well, now I really am going to try to take the kingship away from you. But what is interesting about this? Why does Abner say that he is going to help David be king? What is he? That's not what he says. I think that's true, but that's not what he says. What's going on here is, one thing he notices in verse 9, it's interesting, he notes that the Lord has sworn to David to put him on the throne. How does Abner know that? Well, we don't know. But what's interesting is the fact that Abner knows that. What is Abner's view on the promise of God to David? How does Abner feel about the promise of God? Yes, Jen? Exactly. If Abner had taken the promise of God seriously, why is Ishbosheth even on the throne in the first place? The man whom Abner installed. Abner recognizes that the Lord had sworn this, and yet all of a sudden Abner has a newfound respect for what God says. Where did this newfound respect for what God says come from? I'm sorry? Somebody say it? Yes. From selfishness, yeah. Has more to do with with him getting caught. It had an awful lot to do with him getting caught. Abner is a true politician. He quotes Scripture only when it supports a pro-Abner position. Abner now says, okay, I'm going to go accomplish the purpose of God. Well, where were you, last week when the purpose of God hadn't changed? The goal now is to form a single united kingdom from Dan to Beersheba, not under Ishbosheth but under David. And Ishbosheth has no answer to that. But there's a lesson here, a very informative lesson to us. What is our attitude towards the promises of God? Is what God says simply a matter of convenience? Is it simply a matter of, I'll believe what God says when it's convenient for me, when it's beneficial to me, but I want to go try my own thing first over here. No, we've got no place doing that. That's rebellion against the Lord. The truth is that 2 Samuel chapter 2 shouldn't have happened. That whole segment we read about the battle, that should have never taken place. What we should have read was 2 Samuel 2, the first 7 verses where David gets anointed king. And then we should have immediately been able to jump to what it says in chapter 3 and verse 9 and 10. That the whole kingdom is being transferred to David. But instead what happens is Abner makes Ishbosheth king in Mahanaim. And he starts a battle, and he defies the Lord's anointed, and now he's come full circle to having to follow the Lord's purposes anyway. Well, of course, this comes back to bite him, because if it hadn't been for the events of those chapters that we should have been able to skip over, Abner probably would not end up dead at the end of chapter 3. But we'll pick up on that next time when we look at the fate of Abner and Ishbosheth. So I thank you for your attention, and I hope that this has been beneficial and edifying. And we'll pick up next time in 2 Samuel 3 and verse 12.